Thanks very much for the opportunity. It's a bit of a step change in this one, because what I want to do is to come at this from the perspective of governance. Land decisions are essentially a governance issue. They're an issue of politics and governance. And I want in this short slot just to think of modelling as a governance tool and what implications that has in relation to its how it plays out in different forms of governance, and also to a certain extent some of the ethical dimensions that implies of using models of different kinds. A little bit first about why I'm here. So 30 odd years as a civil servant until quite recently, working on sustainable development governments, really I suppose starting back with being one of the co-authors of This Common Inheritance for Chris Patten in 1990, so I've been on this path for a while. Been in Wales the last 20 years, helped to set up the devolved administration there with a number of the things here. Most recently the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and the Environment Act that puts ecological resilience and an ecosystem approach as the central aim of environmental policy. And now I'm in that purgatory that Dante mysteriously forgot to describe, being a practitioner who's gone over to academia and now has to look at all my practice from a theoretical standpoint. And that really, Dante missed a trick there. It really is quite fun. So what I'm going to do is set out three broad approaches, conceptions of governance, of how it operates. I'm going to talk about how modelling links to those, and then just finish with suggestions about how modelling could relate to those in different ways and potentially generate better outcomes. So the three governance approaches are, if you like, quite caricatured. They coexist. These are not things that exist in isolation. They're all found at the moment within policy. So you've got a state planned, which in the terms of the programme corresponds to decision making for the country. We can come on to what we mean by that later. You've got market, which in the context of this I suppose will be decision making for the individual. And you've got what I call enabling, which I think is the community, it's the place, it's the localised decision making. So let's just walk through this. So state planned. State planned has got a lot of roots. State planned is at least 200 years old, possibly longer depending on how you view it. It is the world that is described extremely well by Max Weber when he talks about bureaucracy and academia. It is a world in which we've divided everything up into nice little boxes, which we're expert in and we deal with separately. It demands standard processes that are replicable, both scientifically and bureaucratically. It is essentially top-down. It owes its power to that knowledge. It has that magnificence of knowing what is best. It is dispassionate, what now, and including in this program, we call evidence-based. It's not about, and it determines what is evidence. It's essentially reductive. It is an expert-led system. And it's about really control. So if you think of that in the context of what this system is looking for, when you think about modelling. For one thing, it's a long way away from the action. It's not really in a position where it can check things physically. So it needs modelling because it isn't in the field. It's a long way away from that. I think of experience a few years ago when issues around diffuse pollution. If my recollection serves me right, the Environment Agency created a model to model where they thought it was. In Wales, they walked the rivers. Different scale, different opportunity to actually use a different device to find this. Essentially, the model here is about justifying the power that is exercised. It's about justification of decision making. It therefore really struggles with uncertainty. So however many times you may say your model has all these different possible outcomes, it won't be heard, because the whole point of the model is to justify a decision. That isn't necessarily a pre-made decision. This is not necessarily policy-based evidence making, but it is something that can be latched onto, something that can give a point to hold on to in a storm of uncertainty that is really quite threatening to this model of top-down bureaucratic endeavour. And of course, the fact that it also divides everything up into little boxes is part of the reason why we're here, because we're all in our different boxes in the different disciplines that we use. And although it hasn't been mentioned today, I don't think land itself is not managed as a thing. That's part of the problem. It has at least 4 different regulatory regimes from the 1940s. You've got town and country planning, which we've heard about earlier on. You've got agriculture policy, you've got forestry, and you've got nature. And we mirror that in our disciplines. You've also then got the whole overlay of economic policy and the drivers. So this separation and this way of working has a particular form of governance that asks for certain things. And I mentioned Weber. Iron cage I don't like. The proper translation for me is adamantine shell. This is not that you're locked in, this is that you are protected, you are safe, if you go back to the original German. And Michel Foucault put up there, which is this way in which knowledge and power reinforce themselves. In the model context, that's the extent to which the model demands a certain kind of data, which then feeds back into the model. The one I always think of as one I've worked on in the past is transport policy, where we had assumptions about car growth, which fed the decisions, but none of those outcomes of those decisions, like the amount of road space, was used in the model. The data was simply socioeconomic data. Second one, market. So this is the one we've been in for the last, well, 30 odd years. I even found a mathematical quote from the Chicago School for those who want it. Mathematics has no symbols for confused ideas. People might appreciate that. Only bit of maths that will be mentioned in the entire talk, I assure you, don't be too worried. So this is very much the politics of laissez-faire. It's about price instruments competition. It focuses very much on the individual. It's anti-state, it's anti-planning, it's anti-government, it's about individual choice and behaviour and competition, and which is why I relate this very much to the decisions for the individual in the actual programme. It has an essentially economic rational agent model of society and the way it works, and it's interested in that sort of language. So PES, that we use uniformly now, has come from that. It too has its language. We've got national capital, green infrastructure, all these things that are just a different way of talking about what used to be called nature. So really interesting how that works. And going back to the early piece of paper, this is the world of optimization. This is the world of there is no decision because the decision is in the model. This is the result. So there's no decision to be taken. It's not informing a decision, it is the decision. So it's an this model is a sort of anti-decision, anti-democratic, if you like, model, I would argue. Actually, just go back to that briefly. There was an interesting paper on by one of the right-wing think tanks at the time of the Brexit and our land sort of work, where they said they looked at farmers, particularly at hill farmers, and noticed that all the hill farmers were over 60. So they said we will close down hill farming. It's economically unproductive. They can all retire, and we can use it more economically. So that sort of sense of a very narrow perspective, that's a whole set of communities, a whole set of families actually, because the farmer's actually the head of the household, he's not the only person farming, obviously. But that's where this takes you. It's not interested in distributional effects, it's not interested in particularly the social and cultural dimension. This is probably the more recent one, and the one that a lot of my work has been engaged with, the work we've done in Wales. So this is called enabling, and this is really a response to complexity that acknowledges that complexity is not there to be solved, it's there to be wrestled with. It's something that actually appreciates richness, because richness might actually inform. So I too would argue for noise, because some of that might actually be more relevant than the stuff that you're finding in the middle, depending on what question you asked in the first place. It's essentially decentralized or devolved, different models, different parts. It puts a lot of focus on place as a just as we sometimes talk about landscape as a thing that links systems that are otherwise unlinked, so the social, economic, ecological systems thinking that you see. Very much about that reconnecting that you can do, and reconnecting in terms of participation. It favours emergent and adaptive responses rather than the sort of state planned. So its interest is sort of taking no regrets type decisions, or decisions that could lead in a number of ways depending on where you go. It's a very different model than the I know exactly where I'm going, those sort of objectives. It also has a different value on data. The other two have very clear senses of what constitutes data and what is not admissible. And to a large extent, we've signed up to that culturally. We don't. I mean, a colleague from the Woodlands Trust, that sort of sense of we try and talk the language of green infrastructure or ecosystem services, when what we really mean is we like trees. But you can't say that because that's disallowed from public policy, because it's not conforming to this hard data, maths, economics version of the way decisions should be taken. So those sort of things that are actually often things that are motivational and get us back to the certain fact that we are not rational economic agents as individuals, but are actually rather more complicated than that. That's something that this actually celebrates and enjoys. So very much around valuing different knowledges, valuing people. This is the world of local ecological knowledge for the ecology colleagues. And interestingly, that sort of thread of local ecological knowledge goes back, at least in part, to some of the writing that was part of the Millennium Ecosystems Assessment. Yet the UN has largely taken a market-based and a plan-based approach to addressing those in terms of its major instruments because of the forces in the other boxes. And in many ways this is about motivating people rather than directing people. So this might well fit with the last talk in terms of points of change and points of engagement, but in a much more interpersonal way rather than the blunt instrument. I've thrown out a couple of quotes there. Ulrich Beck, Risk Society, reflexivity, so we're living in a world that's beyond controllability was his phrase, and talked about reflexivity being effectively having the ability to see how what you were actually aiming to do was itself sowing its own seeds of destruction, now it therefore needed to change the question effectively. And Volker's work, which is around this sort of adaptive management. How would I have time? This is an interesting one. Just to give a couple of examples, I mentioned the EA NRW one earlier. This sort of world of actually this being about dialogue, not about telling or deciding, is an interesting one. I particularly remember one of the sessions we had where there was quite a standoff between the environmentalists and the forestry people, until the line came through. I couldn't possibly agree with you in that in principle, but if we were stood together in a field, we could probably work out how we found space for each other. So this sort of more grounded sense is very important. How are we doing? Good. Okay. So just to reflect on that briefly in terms of just summarising where I've got to so far. This is the only table. I'm very sorry for those who like tables, and it's not a table with axes on it. I do apologise. So you've got the state planned centralist, very much what we talked about a bit earlier on. The UK is a very centralised state, despite devolution. It's the role of governance is essentially maintenance of control. Its aim is replication of procedure and replication of activity. It only lives in this world of hard data that it defines. It likes statistics, and insofar as it uses models, it tends to favour large predictive models, because it's a sort of planned economy model. It's that sort of way, and they are about justifying courses of action to others. They typically, this is consultation at best, very little, not usually engagement. Market style is competition, naturally. Actually changed the wording here because I liked optimization from the other because it makes the link across the model. I got price setting, but I changed to optimization because that's actually, it's assuming there's some sort of economic optimum. It's interested in market and consumer data and essentially looks at economic valuation and behavioural modelling, both of which have been quite heavily featured in climate change work, I would say, over the last few years. The enabling one is essentially about co-production, so this is about multi-level governance, linking between those different scales, and its aim is reflexivity. It's about the ability to respond and act. It's essentially place-based, so it's different scale in many ways to this. It values rich data. The more the merrier, the more different kinds the merrier, because it might just inform something you haven't thought about. And it uses models as prompts, as heuristic devices at best. So you might be looking at quite simple models, quite almost toy models that actually can create debate or discussion. So what does this mean then for the process of modelling? I suppose the big issue for me is how does your practice, how does what you do fit with these? So whom does it empower? A big non-transparent model empowers the commissioner. It empowers the government. It doesn't really allow for much challenge. Indeed, its purpose is to brook challenge. Its purpose is to create a justification, either a fresh justification for a new policy or an existing approach that's already there. How does the model deal with priorities and distributive effects? If a lot of those priorities are built into the model, so if it's economic valuation model type approach where you've sort of decided what people care about, that isn't really telling people very much about decision making, because that's excluded an element of decision making. How does it deal with distribution? So who benefits? Who benefits from this? Who's decided who should benefit? We've heard some of this earlier on in terms of what constitutes good from this. And models that sort of don't allow that space to debate that are really problematic for me and have some real ethical issues about them, because they're not allowing a sort of democratic space in that. And that's partly why I suppose I'm calling that we do think about how these models support a more democratic process. So how do they inform, how they support societal choice, rather than just trying to tell people what to do? And how do we find forms in which people can actually engage and use these models, so that they aren't something in rooms like this, but actually things that one can take out and form stimulus for this sort of debate, because a lot of these issues around acceptance are actually about engagement for me. They're about who's empowered to take the choices, what's the information for them. And then this last one for me, I do worry about the reductionism and the desire to solve complexity. I can see why it's hugely seductive. Maths wasn't my thing, but a simple equation, it has a beauty to it. But for me, complexity is life. It's the dynamic as the rest of it. I think it's much more to be enjoyed and tested and explored than it is to be solved. And I think that solving of complexity is very much in those top-down managerialist versions of things. So my I think probably concluding point is how do we use this to enrich debate? How do we use this to engage? How do we use it to democratize? How do we use it so that it is applicable at different scales in a way that is inclusive, so that it isn't something that simply empowers a certain form of governance and a certain point of direction, because that is the risk in a lot of this. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Lots of time for questions.
That's always the danger, isn't it? Yes. Probably won't be any. Hi.
First one is that the people that support the market way of thinking of things would very much like your categorization, because it suggests that the market is not created but somehow exists permanently in some kind of perfect state. Actually, states create markets and have to work very hard to create them. First observation. The second one is more on the, I mean, we talk about falling in love with models. It's a nice model, but I'm not quite sure where you would put something like the Cardiff City Region organisation. Is that in the nasty state at the top, or in the nice, benevolent, enabling level? Because my concern is that under the guise of isn't enabling great, the coalition government in England destroyed a lot of functional area decision making.
Yes, I used to be a director in a government office, bless them.
The government knows best.
Yes.
So actually, the state can actually create enabling for its own purposes, and they can be quite counterproductive.
What I was doing was presenting these as sort of almost like abstracts. So the fact is they interplay with each other, and politics finds different alliances across these. So yes, city region is entirely framed top down. The goals are set by Whitehall, and the sort of game you have to play and the words you have to use are set there. So it's quite different. In the more localised thing, you actually, I think we mentioned it earlier on, the question is what's the question, not what's the answer or what's the problem. You're actually looking to define what you're even talking about. And these are quite difficult. I've been running some training courses for NLW and Welsh Government staff, and this sort of getting away from only using this sort of hard set of data and this sort of language, and also being prepared to be open to not knowing an answer, and even maybe not even knowing what the question is, to be framing a question so that you can understand what's going on, as opposed to being the all-powerful expert who's coming in to solve your problem, which is what we've all been taught to do, is really quite tricky. So a lot of this is about institutions of bureaucratic path dependencies, if you like, and their assumptions around knowledge systems. And I'm not saying that any of these are, in sense, a perfect solution. What I'm saying is there is a diversity of roles, and your model needs to think how it plays into those, and whether it's reinforcing or supporting different types of governance assumptions.
Yep.
Your talk reminded me of this Eleanor Ostrom article on the polycentric approach to
Yeah.
can't ask her, so I'll ask you. I don't know.
No, she's not been with us for a few years, sadly.
Seems to me, with a difficult problem like climate change, this local approach can only work if they become seeds that grow and essentially end up changing the market and the state. Is that the argument of how
It's partly that. It's also partly that the response is very spatially dependent. We know that in ecology. It's extremely spatially dependent. If you layer that not just with the ecology but also the social infrastructure and the local livelihoods, then the right answer for that place is going to be very, very particular. And if there isn't space for that decision making to happen at the particular level, it isn't. So it may be that it's about the question is framed more broadly, but the answers are found more locally, and those sort of things where you're talking about a range. Ostrom's interesting. I mean, she's coming from a different place emotionally from me, because she comes from economics in a way, and her vision is around efficiency of dealing with issues around commons, isn't it? It's a different one, but we're not a million miles apart, but the value systems are probably a bit different.
Okay. Can we thank both speakers?